from Taylor.
I've not. Is Kathy waiting to come in by chance? If not, I'll start making calls.
Yeah, we're waiting on Kathy as well. We have about 3 minutes until showtime.
Thomas? Or Tia?
Yes, ma'am.
Kathy's going to be logging on shortly. She was having a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, she's on right now. We got her.
Thank you.
Ms. Chair, we're ready.
I now call to order the Thursday, May 28th, 2020 meeting of the City of Sugar Land Planning and Zoning Commission. Item 2, public comment. 2A, is there anyone who has signed up that wants to address the commission with regard to any of the matters on the agenda this evening?
No, we did not, only for the public hearings.
Only for the public hearing. Wonderful. I will move on then to item 3, the minutes. 3A, consideration of an action on the minutes of the May 12th, 2020 meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, a motion by Commissioner Landine, who seconded?
This man I did.
Okay, Commissioner Gallagher. So is there anyone who has any comments before we vote? Okay, go ahead and vote.
Kathy, AP is not going to be able to vote. He's on telephone at this time.
To be heard on proposed city-initiated rezoning from standard single-family residential R1 to general industrial M2 to the Hill Area Residential HR1 for approximately 9.7 acres located on the north side of Lakeview Drive between Wood Street and drainage parcel R157753, 38 single-family lots, addressed 203 Lakeview Drive through 715 Lakeview Drive, and on the south side of First Street between Main Street and Wood Street, Lonnie Green Park. Abigail, is that you?
Yes, hi.
Oh, wait a second. Am I supposed to read? No, that's the second portion. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I am here to talk about the rezoning of the properties mentioned. But first, I will cover what we'll be talking about tonight. First, I'll do a brief recap of the project background, and then I'll go into the overview of the proposed rezoning for Area 1 and Area 2. Then I will finish off my presentation with some initial points for your consideration. And then at that point, the commission can open the public hearing, followed with discussion and direction after the public hearing. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. This information may be familiar to you. We covered it at a workshop back in March before the pandemic. And so just to remind you, the Hill is an original company town neighborhood and used to be housing to those employed by the sugar factory. Some of those homes still exist today. In the mid-1990s, there was an effort to see if the neighborhood was interested in additional character regulations. However, at that time, the neighborhood was opposed. However, recent concerns that were brought forward to City Council regarding the spike in demolitions and redevelopment happening in the area. And we also heard through resident feedback through the land use plan that directed us to engage with the neighborhood on this topic. Next slide. Just to orient yourselves, so the Hill is located in the northern part of the city. This here is US Highway 90. It's noted by the black arrow here. And so it is bounded by Main Street, 7th Street, Wood Street, and along Lakeview Drive. This neighborhood is all single family with some additional uses. It is zoned HR1 and R1. All of HR1 and then R1 noted in this crosshatched area here. And then the park down here is zoned M2. It's not platted except for a few lots in the area east of Wood Street and south of Lakeview Drive. However, although it's not platted, they are legally recognized lots because they were created before the subdivision regulations. There is no known deed restrictions or HOA, and there is a variety of housing styles in this area. Next slide, please. The Hill Community Engagement Project was identified as an action item in the 2018 land use plan, and the future land use map classifies this area as a company town neighborhood. And so a project which is initiated in 2018 to determine whether additional development regulations or other tools were desired by the community to maintain the character of this neighborhood. And so that officially kicked off with the appointment of the Hill Neighborhood Steering Committee back in 2018. Next slide. So we approached this project in 2 phases. First being the public engagement phase to determine whether the neighborhood was interested in the city engaging with them on this topic. And so the outcome of that after a heavy public engagement process was a vision drafted by the steering committee and recommendations, including to move into a phase 2 for implementation. So currently we are in phase 2 and implementing phase 1 recommendations, which includes tonight's item. Next slide, please. So whenever we went to City Council to wrap up and discuss with them the phase 1 recommendations, they told us to try to move as quickly as possible in phase 2 due to the rapid redevelopment in the area. And so some items that we identified for immediate implementation were the rezoning and initial development code changes. So that would include the rezoning, modifying the HR1 zoning district and revising development regulations for garages and front yard setbacks. We heard very clear direction on these items during phase 1, and there are things that we already regulate in the development code. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the recommendations includes modifying the HR1 zoning district to include homes east of Wood Street and north of Lakeview Drive into HR1. So that would be area 1, notated by the crosshatch in the map and also denoted by the arrow. And then in addition, staff is also recommending that we zone Lonnie Green Park, noted by area 2, in the purple, noted by the arrow as well, into the HR1 zoning district. And it's a city-owned park. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the Hill Area Residential Zoning District. This is a standard residential zoning district. It was created with the adoption of the 1997 Development Code, and it is a zoning district specific to the Hill neighborhood, and recognizing that it is a different building pattern than the other residential areas in the city. The regulations, however, do not currently require new construction to build in character. Most of the regulations currently in HR1 are very similar to R1 with a few exceptions. Next slide, please. So for the site analysis, we have here a zoning map that denotes area 1 in the black boundary, the area considered for rezoning. It includes 38 single family lots, so about 7.7 acres. The current zoning is R1, and we're proposing that it be included in the HR1 zoning district. It's surrounded by residential uses to the north and the south, as well as some civic uses, which would include a church to the north here, and then as well as Lakeview Elementary and Sugarland Auditorium to the south here. Next slide. The area is not platted other than a few lots. And so we had to hire a surveyor to draft the legal description for boundary of the area. Again, this is the boundary, not an individual survey of each lot. It's just the boundary of Area 1, which would be the black boundary shown in the previous map. The homes proposed for rezoning are consistent with the character of HR1. The next slide. And here's just a few examples of the homes found in that area. In Area 1, which are proposed to be rezoned. Next slide. And these are homes that are currently in HR1, more in that central area west of Wood Street. So you can see from the photos they are in character. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the regulations between HR1 and R1, they're mostly the same, except in a few cases. Any existing structures for the proposed rezoned properties would not be required to comply with the HR1 regulations, only if there's new construction or if they're making modifications. So property owners would not be required to retrofit their property to meet any regulations. And then I just would also like to remind you that the next item is proposed development code changes would apply to newly rezoned properties if approved. Next slide. So this table shows a comparison for the bulk regulations between the current HR1 and R1. So you can see I've noted the differences in bold in the table, and so they're very largely the same regulations except for a few related to garages and height. And then in this case, we do have a maximum lot width. Next slide. As far as Area 2, like I mentioned, this is a Lonnie Green Park. It is 2 acres. It is a city-owned park. Its current zoning is in M2 General Industrial, and we're proposing that it be rezoned to HR1. It is surrounded by residential and civic uses. So residential is located to the north, and then immediately to the south is Oyster Creek, and then Sugarland Auditorium is here. Next slide, please. So yes, it is a city-owned park, currently zoned M2, not necessarily compatible with the adjacent residential zoning. And so we thought this would be a good opportunity for it to be consistent with the future land use map and the adjacent residential. Next slide. And this is just a photo of Lonnie Green Park. So this is actually on the corner of Wood and First Street. And then the park extends down the street to Main Street. However, that's just open space. Next slide. So here is the future land use map. Area 1 shows that it is company town neighborhood, and then Area 2 is shown or classified as regional parks and open space. Next slide. Again, this shows a zoomed in view focusing on Area 1, and it shows that the proposed rezoning is compatible with the future land use map as well as surrounding areas with its land use designation of company town neighborhood. Next slide. And Area 2 is shown or classified as regional parks and open space. Parks are usually implemented through the R1 zoning district. However, in this case, HR1 is appropriate since it's the adjacent residential use. Next slide. And so we notified the public of the public hearing tonight through the regular means such as website, newspaper. We've sent property owner letters, and then we did additional public engagement and notification by using social media tools such as Nextdoor, some email blasts, and sending it out to Friends of Old Sugarland, and then as well as notifying the whole neighborhood with some letters. Next slide. And so this public hearing was actually scheduled originally for March 26th. However, due to the pandemic, we postponed the public hearing for tonight. And so we received 4 informational inquiries, and we are not aware of any opposition to the rezoning at this time. Next slide. So some initial points for your consideration. The proposed rezoning is a result of public engagement and recommended during phase 1 of the Hill project. The single family homes in area 1 are very similar in character to the HR1 zoning district. The rezoning of Lonnie Green Park, a city-owned park, will replace incompatible M2 zoning classification, and it would be consistent with adjacent residential land uses. And then this also is consistent, the rezoning is also consistent with the comprehensive plan and future land use map. Next slide. And so next steps and recommendations would be to open the public hearing and then have discussion and direction after the public hearing closes.
Okay, I now open the public hearing, and I'm not sure who would read those comments that we've received into the record.
I will, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Christy.
You ready?
Mm-hmm.
We had 2. The first one was from Mary Von Tuglen, and she writes, members of the Planning and Zoning, my name is Mary Von Tuglen, and I'm a former member of the Hill Neighborhood Steering Committee. I would like to commend the city staff, current committee members, and the residents of the Hill neighborhood for working hard to come together with the recommendations that are in the public hearings tonight. Considerable effort was made to receive neighborhood input, and I believe that what you will be seeing reflects that input. I'm a 30-plus year resident of the city of Sugar Land, all those years spent living within walking distance of or in the Hill neighborhood. I formerly served on the Sugar Land City Council, and the Hill was one of the neighborhoods represented each year as a district council member. I am also a non-resident property owner in the Hill, so many changes impact me directly. And then her comments follow. I strongly support rezoning the north side of Lakeview and Lonnie Green Park to HR-1. These areas are intrinsically tied to the Hill neighborhood, and there is no reason for them not to be included in the zoning district. In the public meetings I attended and the feedback I reviewed from surveys, this was one decision point that had a lot of clarity. And that's all she wrote. And the second comment comes from Melissa Hoffman. Oh, and I'm sorry, for the record, I need to state Ms. Von Tuglen's address. It's 18 Chalice Trail, Sugar Land, Texas, 77498. The second one comes from Melissa Hoffman, residing at 1 Cleveland Land Drive, Sugar Land, Texas, 77498. And she writes, I wish to voice my support for the rezoning of approximately 9.7 acres to HR1. As a member of the Hill Neighborhood Steering Committee, we spoke with several residents during the process, and all were adamant that the area located on the north side of Lakeview between Wood Street and the drainage ditch were considered a part of the Hill and should be provided the same considerations as the neighbors to the south. The rezoning will enable the consistent application of all development code changes in the efforts to maintain the character of the neighborhood. And she writes, thank you. And that's all I had.
Okay, thank you very much, Christy. I guess, those being the only comments, we will go ahead and close the public hearing and then move on to review of and discussion on city-initiated rezoning from standard single-family residential R1 or general industrial M2 to the Hill Area Residential HR1 for approximately 9.7 acres. Does anyone have any questions for Abigail?
I do, Kathy. I don't know where you want to begin.
Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. Abigail, I have a couple questions for you. The first has to do with the areas. So, I mean, I understand the Area 1 and Area 2 as it's defined on the charts, but my question is, is a fewfold. Is that everything that the city staff thinks it makes sense to include an area? I'll give you two examples. One is, on area 1 on Lakeview Drive, as you are going east down Lakeview Drive, there are, I think, a couple cul-de-sacs on the south side of the street in which there are houses. You can see one of them on page 7 of this map. And I'm just wondering what the rationale is of including the homes that are on the north side of Lakeview Drive and not anything to the south of Lakeview Drive, if my understanding is correct. And then same question with respect to some of the houses that are on Fifth Street and facing north, east of Wood Street. It seems to me that those are adjacent to the area too. And I'm assuming there's a good reason for area 1 and 2 being drawn the way they are drawn. But having driven through that area and seeing it, I'm just trying to get an understanding of what that reason is. So hopefully the question makes sense.
Yes, and you're referring to the homes to the north, is that right? North of the area 1?
No, if I'm remembering correctly, if you're on Lakeview and you're driving east, and you've got the school there, right?
Yes.
And then you've got a park area, but are there not streets on the south side of Lakeview? Are there not a cul-de-sac or two? I guess it's not Hillary, but I'm talking about south of Lakeview. But are there not a few homes on the south side as well, to the east of the school and the park?
Yes, yes. So those are currently already in the HR1 zoning district.
Okay, got it. I figured there was a reason. I thought I'll ask.
Sure.
And then in question with respect to, I think there are some homes on Fifth Street east of Wood, on the facing north, so across the street from whatever, I can't remember that field is or the construction. Are those also already zoned?
Neighborhood.
Okay, that makes sense because that starts, I guess, so that's part of Sugar Hill. Okay. And my other question is, and thank you for that, by the way. Like I said, I figured there was a reason. So what I'm understanding from the materials is that there are current regulations within the HR1 zoning district, but we are also about to take up at least a discussion of some changes to what an HR1 zoning district would look like. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is correct. So the next agenda item, we would be covering some proposed changes to that.
Okay, and if it's more appropriate, I can hold my questions to then. I do see that on page 5 of the staff report, you've got a description of what the current R1 requirements are and the HR1 and then the proposed HR1. So I guess for right now, I would say that before we consider the proposed HR1, so just comparing current R1 to current HR1, it looks to me like the only differences that the zoning change would have are around the maximum height of principal structures and the garage setbacks as well. Is that about right?
And you're referring to the current HR1 zoning regulations, is that right?
Okay. Before we consider any of the changes to HR1, right. And I heard you say that those would not be enforced retroactively, right? So the current
right.
property does not need to retrofit. A couple of questions along those lines. So if the properties are sold, is it also true that the new owners are not required to retrofit as long as they leave the structure the same?
Right.
But if they ever remodel or do a tear down or anything on the properties, then they're going to have to comply with whatever the then current development code is for that zoning provision, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So if there's and again, I don't know if this is true or not, but basically, they can have a house of a certain height. If they want to redo it, it's going to change the height, and if they have to redo it, then that's going to change the garage setback that they can do as well. Correct?
Right.
But it's only an issue if they do a remodel or a redo of their structure. Correct?
Right, because at that point they would need to submit or apply for a building permit, and we would go through the review process with them.
Okay. And then I just want to make sure sorry, I have so many questions. I know it's a little out of character for me, but this one I just do happen to have questions about. So on the rezoning of area 2, okay, so that's that's currently a park, right?
Yes, it's a city-owned park, yes.
It's going to stay a city-owned park, right? I mean, the zoning change is not going to result in any development to that, right?
No,
Okay.
it will continue to be a city-owned park.
Okay, so I'm just curious if it's a city-owned park before and after, why does the zoning change matter for that particular property? What is the impact of the zoning change on that property?
It would help to be consistent with the future land use map. But as far as any impacts, like physical impacts, or it wouldn't change any of that. It would continue to be a park. It's just to be consistent with the future land use map.
Okay. All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Matt. You know what? I normally do start and go down the line. So let me kind of backtrack and see if Dan has any questions. And then we'll go to the right on that side, and then we'll go to the other side. Dan?
No, ma'am. I'm good.
Good. Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to think of who's after Matt. I guess Andy?
Yes, ma'am. Can everyone hear me all right? I got disconnected a second ago.
I hear you.
All right. So just a couple of questions so that I understand. Is this the first expansion of HR1 since this was initiated years ago? Abigail?
Yes. So the original zoning district hasn't been changed. This is the first time that we're in rezoning areas into the HR1 zoning district.
Okay. And so with some of the things we've heard before and what I believe we're going to hear next, we want to, in essence, create governance documents that don't currently exist for these with HR1, right? This changes it from R1, which makes it a little bit more restrictive for what can and can't be done there in this area. Is that correct?
But what do you mean by governance documents?
Well, by creating this area, we're in essence creating a de facto standards that the houses have to adhere. I'm sorry, you just switched on my screen. Standards that the houses have to adhere to with the HR1 proposal, right?
Right. So they are, currently being zoned R1, they would still need to meet R1 zoning regulations. With the rezoning, they would now need to meet the HR1 zoning regulations. With that being said, they wouldn't be required to retrofit anything unless they're wanting to make modifications, certain type of modifications to their home that requires a building permit.
But if I'm reading the differences between R1 and even current HR1, R1 allows a lot more latitude towards what you can build by what I'm saying. Is that correct? You can be higher, you can have different setbacks, you can have your second detached can be taller.
Right, so there are differences, yes.
Okay. And so in effect, we're adding 38 homes to this new zoning ordinance, except it sounded like all of the comments came from people that are currently in HR1. Is that correct? We didn't hear from anybody that's in this new proposed area.
Right, I believe the two people who commented are currently zoned HR1.
Okay. All right. I guess the rest of my questions go towards the next section, so I'll wait till we get to that part. So thank you, Abigail.
Okay, Suzanne, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Matthew hit all of my questions. The only one I really have a question on that still stands is the park issue, Abigail. I know you said it's a city park and it's going to remain a city park. Under HR1, would the city ever be able to sell that property and use it for any other purpose as under HR1 other than housing? I don't see that happening, but we never know what's going to happen 20 years from now in this neighborhood. I want to see protected.
Right. No, there is no intention, at least to my knowledge, that the park would ever be sold. And it will continue to be a park.
Sorry.
And even the, go ahead.
If it were sold, what could be built on that property?
The lot in itself is very, very shallow. So honestly, there is not a lot of room for anything to be built. So I think that in and of itself would restrict anybody for trying to build anything there. But just reiterating, there is no intention to sell the property. It will continue to be a city park.
Great, that's my only concern. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm gonna go to the other end and see if AP, who's joining us on the phone, has any questions.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, AP. Checking to see with Taylor.
No questions. Just I think it's impressive what staff has done with as much pride as homeowners take in this community for there to be no opposition and really, praise from somebody like Mary Von Tomlin is really credit to you guys. So well done.
Okay, thank you. And Jay, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do have a couple questions. Thank you. Carry on from Commissioner Gallagher's question. Area 1, everything north and east of that is platted sugar mill, correct, Abigail?
North of Area 1?
Yeah, north and east of Area 1, is that all? That's all platted sugar mill?
Yes, that is correct.
And then Area 2, and that's the park side, and that's exactly the same perimeter boundary that the park side is?
Yes, the areas shown are outlined in the map, yes.
And you may have said this, I probably missed it, but you sent letters directly to all the residents in Area 1?
Yes, so there were letters sent to all of the 38 homeowners, as well as those homeowners within 200 feet of the proposed rezoning for Area 1 and 2. And then we also sent property owner letters to the entire Hill neighborhood as well.
That's all I have. Thank you, Abigail. Appreciate
You're welcome.
it.
Thank you, Jay. Carl, do you have any questions?
Of course. I've got to get squared away with Abigail here. There's two write-ups here. Now I've got myself confused. Is one on the rezoning and one on the development code, or am I confused here?
There are two different items before you tonight. This item is related to the rezoning. I just need to
address that. You haven't talked about the development code yet. Is that correct?
That will be the second item on the agenda, and there's a public hearing associated with that.
Oh, okay. Well, I got confused here. All right, on the rezoning, land use. What are other city parks zoned as usually? Just for
they're usually zoned to the nearest residential zoning district, so usually R1.
Okay. And you man, you're right up. You make a comment about over here on page 3 about the park is currently zoned general industrial M2 and is exempt from zoning regulations. So if it's exempt, why are we rezoning?
To be consistent with the future land use map.
No, I'm just reading what you wrote here. It says rezoning Lonnie Green Park. But it starts the second sentence, says the park is currently zoned general industrial M2 and is exempt from zoning regulations. What does that mean? Why do we need to zone it?
Can you state that again?
Your comment says the park is currently zoned industrial M2 and is exempt from zoning regulations.
Yes, that is
Why
correct.
are we rezoning? Why are we even zoning it, period? I mean, I'm just curious.
I have Doug here on the line. I'd like to invite him to see if he can help me answer that question.
Okay.
Good evening, commissioners. Hope you can hear me okay. All land in the city is zoned, and as Abby said, the city is exempt from zoning regulations. But a lot of this M2 that's left over was partly from the Imperial Sugar Company and partly around it. So we think that doesn't need to be M2 over there. Even the question that Suzanne brought up about if it was sold in the future, we certainly don't think M2 would be the way to go right next to the residences. So over time, we've been looking at anything that looks really incompatible. And while we were doing this, we already had the deed to the park. We thought it's a good idea to go ahead and identify it as part of the hill. So again, no zoning on city property affects regulations, but we think it's a good idea, and so did the Hill Task Force.
Okay, so does that mean that all other parks in the city has a zoning on it for that purpose?
All property in the city is got zoning on it, regardless of ownership. Cities, counties happen to be exempt under Texas law, but we think it makes sense to change it.
I accept that.
Yes, sir.
All right. Over on page 5 of this report, where you got this chart, you got the real question is on the last one, detached 2-story garage setbacks. And you got front yard set under the front yard setback. You've done it to the last comment. It says 1.5 feet side and rear setbacks, and you reference M. Well, M says 27 and says 1.5 feet from any rear or side lot line. Well, I don't think that the rear setback's got to be more than 1.5, because, correct me if I'm wrong, there's probably utility easements back there. And those are, I don't know what these are here, but they're anywhere from 16 to something less probably feet. And you can't have a setback that you can, or that you can build in over a utility easement.
Right.
Well,
right. At that point, they would need to locate from the easement. They would still need to have that property, or that whatever that number is. They wouldn't be able to build there.
Okay, but then the proposal says must follow principal structure setbacks. So what is that? I mean, you're trying to change something here, but you don't tell me.
Is that are you on the third column?
Yeah, you get over there. It says must follow principal structure setbacks. Where are they? That's where I guess.
So that is actually related to the second item, the development code changes. But they, to answer your question, the principal structure setbacks would be in the previous page. So they would follow the minimum side yard, minimum street side yard, rear yard, those setbacks. That's what that's referring to.
But you don't have, where's it at on the page 4? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, minimum rear yard setback. No change. All right, well, it's,
But we'll cover that in more detail in the next item.
it's confusing here. And you're in the M, it talks about 1.5 feet from the rear side lot. And
Right, because that is the current HR1 regulations.
even the rear?
Yes.
Are there any structures built over is there a utility easement back there?
I did a little bit of research on that based on some surveys that we received along with the building permits. And it does look like there is a 10-foot utility easement in the rear of the property. So they're not building in the utility easement. And so they're right there, like within 10 feet, in 10 feet.
I'm not.
So if there weren't a utility easement, then they would be able to build as close as 1.5 feet from the property line. But because there is one, they are building 10 feet away.
But that's not what this says. It doesn't mention anything about a utility easement. It doesn't say that. You're not accounting somewhere in this there for the utility easement if it's there. I don't see that. So if you say it's
We'll
1.5.
whenever they apply for their permit, that's when we would know.
Let's wait, Carl, let's wait and discuss that in the next public, in the next item, because that it addresses the development code, the proposed development code changes. And then we can get into that in more detail there. I'm just curious if this change, if the, and I didn't look closely enough at it, and I was just trying to figure this out, but you could probably answer more quickly. Was the 1.5 foot rear setback allowed for those homes maybe that were along an alleyway? Or I'm trying to figure that out, because that's the current zoning.
Can you restate your question, please?
If the 1.5 foot rear setbacks were maybe for the homes that were along the alleyway that ran behind the homes, maybe I'm trying to figure out why we would allow a 1.5 foot setback if that was maybe what it was along those alleyways. That's all I'm trying to figure out.
Possibly. I believe that these regulations have been in place since 1997, and I think they were trying to kind of see if they would fit whatever was existing. Lisa or Doug, if you have better insight to be able to answer that question.
I can give a little more feedback. Unfortunately, actually, none of us as current staff were working with the planning department at that time. But what I have been told early on is that there were some older garages that were closer to the back. Carl is right. There's the utility easements in that, but that's what the city adopted back then. Now, staff doesn't sign off on any building permit in any easements in R1 and R1Z and HR1. It doesn't matter. And we don't codify each utility easement on the thing, but the alley area, the alleys are not official on any maps, and it's our understanding though that the sugar company at the time really got started in the 20s with this layout. Kind of had some clear areas back there that they just expected people not to build in because you were basically buying the lot from the company back at that time. I don't know the exact reason for the rear makes, just to be upfront, less sense than some of the sides because I think they were matching some of those existing ones. But staff will be getting into that further in that next item as well. But we definitely don't see much of anything that far back. So again, in fact, that's one reason for some of the proposed changes. But that alley element, although they're not formal or official alleys, there was definitely something going on back in the original mindset of that.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug. Carl, do you have more?
Well, I just want, do we know where the easement is back there, Doug? Do we have a description of a utility easement in the back of these lots? Anywhere?
The main ones we have are by surveys that are brought with the properties. The city is not, to my knowledge, sitting on a lot of separate instruments for these. That's about all I could say right now about them, but they're checked with each building permit with the surveys.
Well, let me ask you another way. What utilities are back there? Do you know that? Does anybody know that?
I know part of it's for sure electric because they're run behind these. As far as
they're in the overhead still, right?
Right, they're still back there. That's exactly right. There are a few others in different spots, but that's something that we can talk with engineering about a little more to see if we can provide a little more information for y'all.
Well, I think if we're going to if there's going to be we're changing setbacks or whatever, I think we need to know, if there's garages or anything that's built currently over those easements. And particularly going forward, if anybody wants to change, if we don't know where the utilities are at, how can we set any setback? I mean, I don't think.
Let's just wait till the next item, Carl, to bring that up.
Well,
And does anyone else, do you have any other questions?
not on this part.
Okay, so then we'll take that up in the next item. Is there any other questions before we move on? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to item B. Public hearing, receive and hear all persons desiring to be heard on proposed development code amendments to Chapter 2 zoning regulations. Abigail again.
For my overview, I'll be briefly discussing the relationship of the development code to the HR1 zoning district. Just to remind you all of that, I will be going over a little bit of background and process and reviewing the proposed development code changes. So mostly related to front yard setbacks, garages, and other applicable changes. And then from there, the commission can open the public hearing, and then after the public hearing is closed, can provide discussion and direction. Next slide. So the relationship between the development code and the HR1 zoning district, just as a reminder, the development code is a collection of city ordinances that address all aspects of development, such as zoning and other things like that. And its main purpose is to ensure safe, orderly and efficient development. And then zoning is a tool to regulate land uses and physical development of land, such as the size of buildings and relationship to surroundings. So things like setbacks and things like that. Next slide. So just as a reminder again, recommendations for phase 2 that I covered in the other item, the recommendation for front yard setbacks is to explore front yard setbacks to allow original homes to add or extend porches. We heard some concerns during phase 1 about not being able to add porches just because the homes are older than the regulations themselves, and so many of them already encroach into the 25-foot required setback. Next slide. And then we also heard a lot of input related to garages. And so the recommendation is to explore current garage regulations to address setbacks and height. And so that would address each of the scenarios listed here related to, for example, one-story detached garages can continue to be 1.5 feet from the property line, and then some other regulations related to attached garages. Next slide. Again, these are things that we heard very clear direction on during phase 1, and we already regulate in the development code. Next slide. As far as the drafting process of the regulations, staff did conduct a lot analysis, and then we also did peer city research to draft them, the regulations. We looked at things such as lot size, width, and depth, and then worked very closely with the development planners as well as the city's legal department. Next slide. We shared our recommendations, draft regulations with the Hill Steering Committee, and we reviewed the changes with them back in February. They had a few clarifying questions, and then they thought that the proposed regulations met the intent of phase 1, public input and recommendations. And so overall, they recommend the proposed changes. Next slide. And we do have the steering committee chair joining us on the line here later. You have any questions for her or anything that she can address? So overall, the summary of the proposed changes, I'm just going to go run through a quick summary of that, and then we can get into the details. For our front yard setbacks, we're proposing to create a new front yard setback for unenclosed porches, allowing them to be closer to the front property line. For garages, we're proposing to distinguish garage regulations depending on height and type of garage. So differentiating between attached and detached, and then also amending regulations for accessory structures other than garages so that they're consistent with the proposed one-story detached garage regulations. Next slide. We're also recommending to locate the HR1 existing and proposed regulations to propose regulations to new part 7 within chapter 2, article 2 of the development code. And then also amend other applicable code sections to reflect the new location of the HR1 regulations in part 7. Next slide. Tonight you'll be reviewing the proposed changes and providing input on the clarity of the proposed regulations and changes, considering public input, including the steering committee's recommendation. And then you would be providing a recommendation to City Council on proposed regulation consistent with the feedback from phase 1, as well as public input. And so you would be providing your recommendation at a subsequent meeting, since tonight is discussion and direction. Next slide. So before I jump into reviewing the code changes, I just want to mention that I will be going over them in the order of the new proposed section in the code. So if you'd like to refer to what the draft code text would be, it is the handout titled Draft Part 7, the Hill Area Residential District. It's a Word document that has some blue comments on there. Okay, next slide. So the development code structure. So the regulations are located in chapter 2, article 2, and they're currently, the HR1 regulations are currently located in part 2 standard residential districts, along with the other residential zoning districts such as R1, R1Z, and the like. And we are proposing to create a new part 7 down here, section specifically for the Hill area residential. So that would be part 7. Next slide. And so this would be similar to how the mixed use conservation district is set up. Those regulations are located in part 4. And so we're recommending that HR1 be in part 7. That would be beneficial for staff and the public to find and locate any regulations related to HR1 in one section. And then we were also amending other sections of the development code as applicable to reflect the new section, such as the ones listed here. Next slide. So the structure of Part 7, the Hill Area Residential District, begins with the purpose and intent, definitions, reserve section, uses, district regulations, and then other regulations. Next slide. So the HR1 zoning district already has an intent statement, but we thought it would be good to expand that to more clearly explain the intent of the regulations. And so that is notated in bold here on the slide. And so I'll just give you a minute to read that if you'd like. Okay, next slide. And then we are proposing to incorporate some definitions here that would only apply to HR1 because the current code only defines private garage. It doesn't necessarily distinguish between attached or detached. So I thought it would be good to have a specific definition for attached and a definition for detached garage, as well as defining porch. And so the main difference between attached and detached garages would be that for attached, that they share a common wall with or is located less than 5 feet from the principal building. And they would be considered detached garages if they're located 5 feet or more from the principal building. Next slide. So for section 2-157, permitted uses and parking schedule, we copied the table with uses only allowed in HR1 from its previous location in section 2-71. And we're proposing to remove uses that were previously allowed but are not necessarily applicable in the Hill. That would include things like a golf course, HOA clubhouse, residential sales office. None of those things necessarily apply in the Hill. However, they were allowed. So we're recommending that those be removed or not allowed. Next slide. So section 2-158 district regulations. This is where all of the changes that we'll be discussing are. So as you can see here, we'll be looking mainly at front yard setbacks as well as private garage restrictions. Some of the other regulations had no changes to that. Next slide. So for front yard setbacks, we are created, like I mentioned, what we're calling a new front yard setback of 15 feet specifically for porches. This would only apply to unenclosed porches up to 16 feet in height. Any glass enclosed screen porches or porches greater than 16 feet in height would need to meet the principal structure front yard setback. So essentially the 25 feet noted in the first bullet. And then there is currently an allowed yard obstruction regulation for steps and eaves of 2 feet. There's no change to that. Next slide. We also added some diagrams to illustrate the porch front yard setback as well as the maximum height. And there the diagrams on the slide here that we would be including. Next slide. And so maximum height would be measured from the finished grade to the intersection of the highest point of the porch roof and the facade as noted in the diagram. Next slide. And so for front yard setbacks, just depending on how close an existing home is to the front lot line, a homeowner may or may not be able to add a porch under the proposed regulations. There are some homes that are very close to the front property line. And so in that case, if they're closer, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to add a porch, just again, due to the varying setbacks. However, we thought that it would be the best approach to prevent having porches that were too close to the front lot line. We would still want to have that 15 feet of open space in the front yard. Next slide. For private garage restrictions, we're proposing a minimum garage setback from the front facade of the principal building, not including the porch. So that would be 15 feet and would apply for both attached and detached garages. If you've ever been to the Hill neighborhood, one of the main character features in this area is that garages are located to the rear of the property. So this regulation would help kind of maintain that character there with garages. We've added diagrams to illustrate that, and then we went ahead and clarified that only one private garage is permitted per lot. The current regulations state that there is a total square foot maximums for all accessory structures, which include private garages. And so just the way that is worded could technically mean that there could be multiple garages on the lot. So we just wanted to clarify that. Next slide. And here are the proposed diagrams to explain the attached garage. So the image on the left is an example of the 15 feet setback from the front facade, not including the porch for an attached garage scenario. And then the image on the right shows the 15-foot setback from the front facade for a detached garage. And then also notes the 5-foot distance from the principal building, which is what we're using as a definition for detached garages. Next slide. Specific regulations to attached garages, we're proposing that they follow the principal building home regulations. So for front yard setbacks, that would include the 25-foot setback in addition to the 15-foot facade setback. And then for them to follow the home or the principal building setback, side setbacks and rear yard setback, which would be 10 feet and 15 feet. Currently, like we mentioned earlier, the attached garages are able to follow the 1.5 feet side and rear setbacks. Next slide. So for detached garages, including 1-story and 2-story, previous slide, please. Previous slide. Thank you. We're proposing a minimum distance from the principal building of 5 feet. So that again is related to how we're defining attached versus detached. If it's 5 feet away from the principal building, it would be considered detached. If it's any closer than that, we're considering attached. And so a breezeway would be allowed to connect between the detached and the home, detached garage and the home. And so that wouldn't, if there is a breezeway, we wouldn't be considering that attached as long as there's the 5-foot distance between the home and the garage. Next slide. So specifically for detached 1-story garages, there is not, we're proposing that there not be a change to the setbacks. So continue to allow them to be 1.5 feet. And then however, we're proposing a maximum height of 16 feet for detached 1-story. And we're also proposing a regulation for eaves that they must be 6 inches from the side or rear lot line. And so we're just trying to address some concerns that we heard about specifically related to the setback that where rainfall may spill over into the other property, the neighboring property. However, we do recognize that depending on like the intensity of the rain, that may still happen. But we hope to try to address that a little bit through this regulation. Next slide. So for detached 2-story garages, the current maximum height is 27 feet. There would be no change to that. And then for side and rear setbacks, we're proposing that they be the same as the principal structure or the home. And so in this case, 10 and 15 feet. Next slide. And so this again shows the comparison of the bulk regulations between current R1, current HR1, as well as the proposed. And there's not really a lot of changes other than kind of what I would just walk through. Of course, this table doesn't cover all of the changes that we're proposing, but the majority of them are remaining the same, such as lot width, lot depth, the main front yard setback, and some others. Next slide. And then finally, we're proposing supplemental regulations for accessory structures that are not private detached garages. We're proposing that they follow the one-story detached regulations. So that would include maximum height, distance from the principal building, front facade, and then side and rear setbacks would not change. And then some of the other items in section 2-159, B through E and G, those would not change either. Next slide. And so we, as I mentioned in my other presentation, notified the residents of the Hill about the public hearing. We went ahead and combined the public hearing notice for the rezoning and the development code changes into one notice, since they are related to the same project. And we went through the avenues listed here to notify them. Next slide. And so we did solicit some input from the community through the city's online town hall platform through a survey. We got 18 responses, and the survey was open for 9 weeks. Like I mentioned earlier, we originally were targeting the March 26th meeting. However, the meeting was postponed to today, and so we extended the deadline to accommodate that. Next slide. And so we heard it in the survey, positive feedback, or where 70% or more of the respondents agreed. And so that would be for the items noted on the slide. For example, the 15-foot setback from the front facade, the 5-foot separation for detached garages, the 16-foot max height for one-story and for one-story detached garages, as well as accessory structures. Next slide. For the other items, where less than 70% agreed, people were a little bit concerned about attached garages and detached two-story garages. Those who didn't agree thought that they should be allowed closer to the side and rear property lines. Next slide. And so we reviewed the online town hall feedback with the committee, and they recommended that to move forward with the proposed changes. They thought that the changes as is met the intent of the phase 1 feedback and recommendations. Next slide. And so finally, some initial points for your consideration. The proposed development code changes are consistent with the feedback we received and recommendations of phase 1. The Hill Steering Committee reviewed and recommend the proposed changes, and we're also amending other sections of the development code to reflect the new location of Part 7. And then the proposed development code changes to the HR1 zoning district would apply to properties proposed to be rezoned into HR1, which we covered in the previous item. Next slide. And so at this time, the commission is able to hold a public hearing with discussion and direction after the public hearing is closed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. I will open the public hearing and ask Christy if there's any comments to be read into the record from the public.
Yes, we have 2. So Mary Von Tuglen at 18 Chalice Trail, Sugar Land, Texas 77498, wrote that she was in full support of the changes outlined in draft 7 and recommended by staff as amendments to Chapter 2 zoning regulations of the Development Code. I believe these changes will foster improvements of existing homes and allow for the new development, both within the character of the neighborhood. Again, these recommendations are are the result of significant neighborhood feedback. Then second, Melissa Hoffman at 1 Cleveland Drive, Sugar Land, Texas, 77498, wrote, Dear Mayor and City Council, as a 25-year-plus resident of the Hill and a member of the Hill Neighborhood Steering Committee, I fully support all the proposed changes to Chapter 2 of the Development Code in regards to the front yard setbacks and garages for District HR1. Residents of the Hill enjoy their walkable streets, visiting with neighbors, and relaxing on their porches under the tree canopies. Yet under current restrictions, not all residents are able to add a front porch, should they so desire, due to the variances in lot sizes. These changes will allow porches to be added in a reasonable manner and still maintain the safety and character of the neighborhood. Times have changed since the neighborhood was first developed in the early 1900s, and today, car-centric culture now includes multiple cars per residence. Recognizing the need to accommodate a modern family's needs while still preserving the neighborhood characteristics drove the committee and staff to speak with and survey residents extensively. Residents felt that garages, if too close or too large to the property line, could negatively impact neighbors and the neighborhood. City staff worked diligently with the committee, utilizing resident input to create reasonable guidelines for the construction of both 1- and 2-story garages that would meet current needs and protect the Hill residents and community. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. I will close the public hearing then, and we will move on to review of and discussion on proposed development code amendments to Chapter 2 zoning regulations. And I understand that the chairman of the committee is here. Is that correct?
Yes.
I didn't know if you had anything, Terry, that you wanted to add.
No, I speak for the residents that we've spoken to, and we worked really hard to find a place that would please the families who've lived here forever and don't want anything to change, and all the new young families that are moving in who, of course, want more space. We feel that what we're proposing is a really good common ground that all would be happy with. We're real pleased with it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I will ask, let me start with Suzanne and ask if you have any questions for Abigail or for Terry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course I do. Terry, thank you for your work on this. I know this is special to you, and since I've known you, this is one of your pet projects, so thank you for your work. Thank you. My question, Abigail, I have two questions. I know we're working on changing some of the development code. We're calling it special zoning. So is there a special zoning district that we're creating, or are we just creating a zoning district for the Hill?
No, we wouldn't be creating a zoning district. The zoning district is already created. And so that's kind of what we covered in the previous item. What we're doing here is amending the regulations for the zoning district.
So in no way is this creating a precedent for future zoning districts. It's just applicable to this district itself.
Right.
Okay, that was my first question. Looking at some of the changes you've made, I know you said you've taken some of the language from the other district we had and just scratched it out. I'm referring to HR1 District Supplemental Regulations, number 1, dwelling accessories. It says the accessory quarters does not contain more than 600 square feet of living space. I'm assuming when we talk about living quarters or accessories, are these garages or just secondary buildings?
I believe we do allow living space on the second story garages in this district.
So those would be existing, and does this mean we are going to allow building a second story living space for new builds or remodels?
In garages specifically, or?
whatever. I know we're limited to one garage. So if we limit it to one garage, it could have a living space on the second floor, I assume. But we wouldn't allow a second building as well.
No, I don't believe so. I believe it's only allowed on the second story. And Doug, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, for the Hill District, under the current regs, you can have accessory quarters above the garage. So that really wouldn't change. It's just going to limit you to not having multiple garage areas, whether attached or detached.
Okay. And then the second line is the occupants cannot pay compensation for the use of the quarters. I'm not sure how you enforce that, and the truth is you really can't enforce that. But I'm assuming you're trying to make sure that we don't have B&Bs or something like that going on. I'm assuming that's what you're trying to do there.
That's a standard reg throughout the city. Any accessory quarters, whether in the Hill or in an R1, that's the existing language, and it's designed to try to get at that sub-rental type thing or rental. Yes, that's true.
Good. I'd like to see that really enforced if possible, because we don't want to see rental property in what we call a residential area, at least not on the same property as a homeowner. Also, on number 3, under parks and recreational facilities, it talks about a reduced parking requirement, are included as a part of a homeowners association facility. This doesn't have a homeowners association. Is that language in there for future use, or is it just something that's in there for another reason?
And can you point me to what you're referencing?
It's on page 5, the same area under district supplemental regulations. It's point number 3, parks and recreational facilities. It refers to a reduced parking requirement may be approved by the director of planning, and it goes on. When recreational facilities are included as part of a homeowners association facility.
Oh, I see. Right. I see what you're saying. Let me find what that note is referring to. Oh, I see. It's related for property owned by private, nonprofit, or homeowners association and used to provide recreational activities to the members of the association. And your question is whether it applies or not?
Right, because there is no homeowners association. I didn't know if that applied to a future homeowners association or if it was just in there for some reason.
No, I'll look at the language more closely. There may need to be a provision there. So I'll take a look at that.
It may be a carryover from when we took this from the regular table.
I just thought maybe I missed it because I know they didn't want one. I thought well, maybe they
right.
Okay, yes, that's all I had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Andy, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple. I want to make sure that I heard you correctly when we talked about second garages. That does not include maintenance sheds or outdoor equipment sheds or things like that, correct? Did I hear that correctly towards the end?
That is correct. So sheds and kind of workshops and other accessory structures, the homeowner could still have that structure.
Okay.
In addition to the garage.
Okay. Am I also reading this correctly where if a home currently is a one-story home, they can only have a one-story garage? They can't have a two-story garage?
I believe they can. I think as regulations that we're proposing, they are allowed to have a two-story garage if they have a one-story home.
Okay. I was trying to follow that, and I think I confused myself. One-story maximum height. Okay. Yeah, it was confusing me on your chart on page 2 of the regulation comparison table. The second to last item, under the current HR1, it's 2 stories or 27 foot, and now it's 16 feet. Why were we higher than R1 and now lower than R1? I wasn't understanding why we would swing so far on that one.
Right. So for garages, we're trying to have kind of regulations for each type of garage. So for 1-story detached garages, we're proposing that there be a maximum height of 16 feet. Just because we are proposing that those 1-story garages continue to be allowed 1.5 feet from the rear and side property line. So allowing still for them to be that close, but with a height limit. And then for those garages that are 2 stories or attached, they would need to be further away from the property, following the principal structure setbacks.
Okay. All right, just my personal opinion, I like the ability to add the porches on all the properties, but a lot of that is to make sure that a new homeowner can add a porch to be in similarity with the other homes in the neighborhood. But I'm concerned that you've made the garage restriction such that they can have the porch to match their neighbor's house, but they can't have the garage to match their neighbor's house. And I was just concerned why we're writing code to come back and add one to match the existing style of the neighborhood and taking away or being more restrictive on the other. I was just curious, and maybe if that makes sense, maybe our person from the Hill could answer that a little bit as well, and just kind of get the neighborhood's feel.
May I speak? The original garages are small, 1-story, fits only a very small car. The problem that we're running into now is that people are building these huge garages, and they dwarf the homes.
Okay.
To add to that, we also heard from some concerns from residents in the neighborhood about 2-story garages being allowed that close to the property line. And then we also heard some concerns about attached garages being allowed that close to the property line. So that would be addressing those concerns and that input that we received in phase 1 during the public engagement process.
All right. Thank you. I'll give back my time. Thank you, Abigail, and where'd you go? Terry, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Moving on, Matt Gallagher, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just one and a couple brief comments. First of all, I want to compliment you, Abigail, and city staff on the document. I mean, I think it's very well done. I appreciate how you track the changes, and I appreciated the comments in here too that helped to track those around. I also think that we really benefit in this process from the survey information that was collected as well. So I want to compliment everyone who was involved in collecting that information. I see, if I'm reading this correctly, that there were about 54 people have somehow referenced the survey, and there were 18 responses, if I'm tracking this correctly. And I think that's good, and I think it's important for all of our citizens to remember that when opportunities are presented to receive input, you need to take advantage of those opportunities and be heard. But I also appreciated the fact that it looked like all of the changes that you're presenting were very, very consistent with what the public opinion was in regard to each of those questions. So that was very helpful to me as a commissioner to make, to decide this issue. The one, it's probably a pretty hyper-technical question, but I have one question that I'll ask. And I'm on page 9 of the report, looking at the different drawings that you have. and I'm specifically looking at figure 2-158.f that shows the detached garage setback from the front facade of the principal building diagram. So it's on page 9 of 10, and it's the drawing on the lower right side of the page, if you're with me. So here's my question. So on the drawing shows, it looks like it's saying that there's a minimum of 5-foot garage distancing from the principal building. And I get that that's what is required definitionally for that garage to be considered to be detached. But my question is this: could you have a garage that's basically in that position, but that's actually closer to 5 feet than the structure? In other words, you could have that, right? It just would be considered to be an attached garage, and it would have to conform to the requirements of what an attached garage is, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So I just think, and again, I think that maybe it's just a wordsmithing issue that to show that because what this drawing is not saying, or should not be saying, is that you're required to have a detached garage B, unless all it's doing is illustrating the definition. Does that make sense? It's not dictating where the garage can go. It's just saying whether or not it's going to be considered for code purposes attached or unattached, right?
Right, exactly. It just helps explain.
Then if all that's doing is clarifying the definition, I get it, but I don't want that to be read as a requirement as to where the garage can be placed on the property. So that was the only question I had. Thank you.
Just to clarify, I guess the main purpose of the diagram is actually to show the 15-foot garage setback from the front facade of the home. But we just wanted to kind of make that note that if you're having a detached garage, there would need to be the 5-foot separation to qualify or to be defined as a detached garage.
I understand.
Okay, great.
Matt, is there some language that you would recommend that would clarify your point? Maybe that they could add to that exhibit or that.
I need to. I'm sorry if I interrupted someone. I apologize. Let me think about that. But I mean, my initial reaction is, if all this is doing, and I'm struggling to kind of link it back to where it actually appears in the document. So give me just a second and see if I can find that. I mean, my thought is just to basically tag it and say that so it's not really, see, this is putting it as 2.158. I mean, that's showing the regulation. And I get that it's showing the setback. I mean, I get your point on that. I think that's required. I don't know if you could maybe just taking it out, maybe taking out the minimum 5-foot garage distancing from principal building. Does that change it? Because, I mean, it's still a 15-foot setback. I don't know. I'd have to think. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I'd have to think about how to wordsmith that. I'm not sure I have a good answer at this point.
Okay, well, why don't you think about that, since we're not voting on it tonight, we're just providing direction, and get back with Abigail or Doug or Lisa and make your recommendation. I looked at it the way that Abigail explained it and hadn't considered what you were saying until you just made the point. And so if we can come up with something that clarifies it, that everyone can agree on, I think that would be a smart thing, just in case there's others that have that same view, that same issue when they look at it.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Carl.
Matt, I'm reading the definition on page 1 for garage attached and garage detached. Doesn't this clear it up? It said attached garage wall with or is located less than 5 feet from the principal building, and garage detached is located at least 5 feet from the principal building. So is that your question, or doesn't that?
No, I understand that, but here's my point. You could have a garage that is separated from the principal building by a distance of less than 5 feet. Okay. You could legitimately put that on your property if you wanted to. Under the code, that would be considered an attached garage because it's less than 5 feet from the structure. All I'm saying is when I look at this figure, that seems to suggest that I have to have that minimum distance there to have a detached garage. And I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent is to just clarify the definition, not to dictate where you can or can't put the garage.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
All right. Care.
And I understand what you're saying. And like I say, I hadn't even seen it from that perspective until you pointed it out. So if we can come up with some good, and my brain is not thinking right now, so I don't even have anything to recommend. But I think between you and probably Doug and Abigail and Lisa, you all can maybe figure something out for that.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, my working, and I'll think about that some more and connect with city staff. My working suggestion is to consider whether or not you could just take out the text where it says minimum 5 feet garage distancing from principal building. If you just took that out, then the drawing is just showing a detached garage. And if it falls under the definition of attached garage, then that's how the setback works. So I would say, and think about that, and if I come up with a better way of calling that out, I'll work on that.
Well, that makes sense to me. Or yeah, and I think that makes sense to me. I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts, but that makes sense to me. And I don't know, Abigail, do you have any feedback?
Yeah, that could work. And then because the detached garage is labeled, they could always reference the definition in the previous pages to know what qualifies or what the definition is exactly of the detached garage. That way it also emphasizes that this diagram is particularly about the 15 foot from the front facade. So yeah, that could definitely work. Okay, great.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Jay.
May I interrupt? I had
Absolutely.
a concern on that. If I was a landowner and I had a detached or a separate structure garage that was 4.9 feet from the house, I'd have difficulty understanding how the city calls that an attached garage. I think there needs to be a better definition or clarification of a structure that's less than 5 feet. It's hard for me to call it an attached garage when it's not attached. And if I was a landowner, I'd have issue with that. So, maybe we can come up with a better definition of that within 5 feet, but calling it attached is difficult for me to handle.
Okay.
That was my
I understand your point. Absolutely.
And so I just want to mention, and is your comment related to the proposed regulation or just like in general across the city?
Well, what we're talking about right now.
Okay. Yes, and the reason that we wanted to make that distinction is so if there's less than 5 feet between the detached garage and the home, and we didn't make that distinction, then technically it could be a detached garage. And so then at that point, they would be allowed to be at as close as 1.5 feet from the property line. So there would be, essentially you could essentially have a kind of a flush garage that runs across, of course, with the setback of the front facade, the 15 feet. But it would appear from the street that the whole structure would be close to the 1.5 feet, if that makes sense. It would appear to be like the overall structure, even though there is a 5 foot separation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. But how does a separate structure become attached? to another separate structure if it's not attached.
Right. So at that there, it might be maybe because a homeowner may be looking at it just what the definition in reality of what attached versus detached means versus what we're defining in the code. So I can see, I see your point about how they may have a hard time understanding that.
Jay, just for general reference, neither good nor bad, but what the code right now is, if you're a detached garage in the standard zoning districts, with 10 feet of separation from the wall of the garage to the wall of the house, you can have a covered breezeway that connects them, that kind of typical style.
Mm-hmm.
In the MUC district, it's much smaller because the garages were closer. And the 5 feet here is also because this is an older area and the garages traditionally were closer. So I'm not sure there's necessarily a real magic way to get it. We may be able to look at a little more, but you can have a breezeway to connect them either way. You don't have to, but you can. But the city has used that wall-to-wall distance essentially as the definition of attached or detached throughout all the cities. So that's kind of where that comes from. This is a lot smaller of a 5 foot rather than the 10, so that it matches up closer with kind of the built environment there, but that's where that comes from.
And then just to piggyback on Doug's comment, the 5 foot separation requirement is existing in the MUC district. So that's where we borrowed that from.
Madam Chair? Madam Chair?
Yes, sir. Go ahead. I had to unmute
I have a
myself.
basic question. What are we trying to accomplish? I mean, to me, it's obvious. Either the garage, if it's attached to the building, it's an attached garage. If it's separated, except by a breezeway, it's a detached garage. Whether it's 5 feet or 3 feet or 10 feet. I don't know what is it. What am I missing that we're trying to accomplish by defining whether it's attached or detached? If it's not actually, except by breezeway, not connected to the house, it's detached, period. Whether it's 3 feet or 20 feet, in my opinion. So unless there's something I'm missing here that we're trying to establish because of some zoning deal or some other something that I'm not hearing.
I can go ahead and answer that question for you. So right now in the HR district, in any district except the MUC, if the garage is within 10 feet of the house, it's considered attached. That's the legal definition.
Is that some purpose of insurance or fire protection or
It's
something?
it's the way that the code is written. So it defines within 10 feet as attached, unless it is just the breezeway. So if it's within 10 feet, it's considered attached.
Even though it's not attached.
Yes. So that's why we're trying to bring it in closer to get it closer to line up. But currently, the way that the code is written and defined, that's the way that we have to enforce it.
But what are we enforcing? That's my whole
Well, I think we're trying to be consistent. So if at some point they decide to change the definition in the code, we'll have to go to wherever it appears and change it all up. But in the meantime, I do get that we need to be consistent with what the definition is in the code. So if that's what the definition is, I think for consistency's sake, it makes sense. And I'm assuming that's the reason. Is that right, Doug?
That's right, and especially due to the work the city's done over the years in the MUC district, that's 5 feet is the literal width of a sidewalk. That's not very much, but it will allow at least, if you had a breezeway less than that, you really don't hardly have anything. But we're trying to be, as we hear a lot from the commission, try to be consistent. We are trying to be consistent with that older area like the MUC. So it's not magical, but it is. We feel like it's a good compromise for this area.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And like I said, if at some point the definition changes in the code, we'll just have to go back to all these other places where it appears and update it. But for the time being, if that's what the definition is, we need to leave it as it is then and be consistent. So, Dan, do you have any questions?
Yeah, not so much questions as comments. This brought back memories from ZBA when I struggled with how something 10 foot away could be attached. It's a definition. It's an arbitrary definition. It's adopted in our development code and our regulations. In this case, like they said, like staff said, in order to maintain some consistency, they shortened it to 5 feet. Again, it's just a definition. It's not meant to say it's attached literally. It's attached figuratively, if you will. And Abby, maybe you can elaborate a little. You mentioned something about it also triggers or prevents something on the other side of the garage or behind the garage, such that once it's considered attached, they can't do a certain deal and end up with like wall to wall. I mean, help me out here. What did you say a minute ago?
Right. So if they're closer to the home than 5 feet, then at that point they would the garage would have to follow the principal home setbacks. So 10 and 15 feet from the side and rear.
And if not,
mm-hmm.
If it was detached, what could those numbers be?
Depending on the height. So that's kind of another thing to factor in.
Right.
Or detached. So if it's 1 story with a maximum height of 16 feet, then at that point they're able to be as close as 1.5 feet from the property line.
Okay, so there's a reason to couple those other than just a breezeway or something like this. But like I said, Kathy, this shot back to ZBA with me because I wrestled. It was like I asked Jay's question back then. Okay, so anyway, that said, I'm in the unfortunate position here of trusting staff and realizing everything they've done over these months. And you hear the feedback from the community and it's all supportive. So I think they've hit this thing on the head in what would otherwise be a pretty difficult task. You go into a community that was built, when it was built, it wasn't platted, all these different development, all different types of homes over the decades. And yet we have some continuity. We have a livable space that people still desire. I think together with the community, they've done a superb job, and I commend them. I don't have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I will move to Apurva, AP, and ask if you have any questions for Abby or for Terry.
Madam Chair, a lot of the... Yeah, I'm live. Yeah, I'm here on the Zoom. No, a lot of the questions that I had, I think Jay kind of covered in terms of the definition. And to echo what Matt and Dan said, that this was a really thorough and really detailed presentation, and especially the survey. I'll going through that again. It's a lot to do, and a lot of effort that's taken to kind of get to where you are. So. Appreciate the team doing that. And so no real questions. Just wanted to put that comment out there that this is greatly appreciated.
Okay, thank you, AP.
You're welcome.
Let's see. I'm trying to think. Taylor.
No, my questions have been answered. I appreciate it.
I'm trying to visualize who's where on our
days.
Yes. Okay, Jay, next.
Oh, Madam Chair, no further questions or comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Carl.
You got me on here? Yeah. On page 2 and 3, we got all of these land uses and all this stuff here. but I don't see where on where we're zoning this, that any of this is all saying this is going R1 or HR1. So why are we going through all this stuff in this area here with these child care and clergy houses and on down the line here? I mean, it's not permissible. Is that correct?
I believe some of those uses are allowed by right due to state law. Doug, correct me if I am wrong.
That's correct. Some are, and then some are also were in the last general code amendment. So there are some things you can do either with the CUP. Churches, for example, you can do with a conditional use permit in residential districts. So there are a few non-residential things that are allowed either by right or with a conditional use permit. And Abby, if I'm thinking right, I'm not on that page, but y'all were looking at some further limitations on some of that. So if it's up for discussion, it was going to be further limited in the Hill on those uses. Is that right?
Right. So that would include the residential sales offices, the golf course, and HOA clubhouse.
Right.
So their uses that we're recommending that they not be allowed.
Because things like a school, private school can be with a conditional use permit, or a church can be with a conditional use permit. They might not get approved, but they can ask for it. So.
But my question is, in looking at what we're zoning here, I don't see a spot. You would have to change the zoning from HR1, wouldn't you, to one of these? Are you saying these are all permissible uses with an HR1 zoning?
Yes, that is correct.
So if they'd have to buy a church, let's say, they'd have to buy 10 houses in order to convert that to a church site.
Potentially, yeah, that is.
I mean, maybe, I'm exaggerating, but.
Right, it's probably not realistic that it would happen.
All this trouble to get there, I'd want to eliminate that problem, but that's not, I don't live there, so I guess that's all right. I was just curious whether it was all in there. On page 6 of this bill, up there, you got all the minimums and maximum lot width, maximum lot width, minimum lot depth, but you don't need a maximum lot depth?
No, that there is not a regulation for that in this district or in any other district, potential district.
I think that that maximum front, that was put in on purpose years ago to keep people from combining more than two typical lots. Yes, sir. Right. Yep.
So they can combine 2, but they can't combine 3 is what you're saying.
Yes, sir. Right.
All right. I'll give you that one. On page 7, let's see, minimum street side yard setback. Front load garage side yard setback. Front lot 15 feet, side load garage 20 feet. I don't understand when we're talking about minimum street side yard setback. It says side yard. This front yard that says front load, that's not part of the side yard. I mean, I'm just saying your chart. If you do the front load, you got that 15, you still got to add another 25 feet because the building line is 25 feet, at least to the house.
So I believe that regulation would be, for example, on a corner lot. So if the garage doors are facing the front lot line, then at that point there would be 15 feet, and it's a side load, then it would be where the garage doors are facing the street side, then it would be 20 feet.
I don't have a problem with the 20 feet. I'm just You got a 15 foot on the front load garage doors facing front lot line. You say 15 feet, that means I can move it 10 feet past the front of the house if I read that literally. Because the front building line for the front lot is 25 feet to the house. And you're saying I can have a garage 15 feet.
Carl, she's saying that the side yard can be 15 feet when the garage faces the front. The side yard is 15 or 20 feet, so it's 15 feet if the garage faces the front, and it's 20 feet if the garage faces the side.
So it's dependent on where the garage is facing.
But it's not, that 15 feet there, if you look at your diagrams, that's 15 feet from the front building line back. That's not, we're talking front load, garage doors facing front.
No, Carl, I think you're
From the
misunderstanding. This is the side. So from the street side property line to the garage, you can have 15 feet if the garage faces front or 20 feet if the garage faces the side. And this is the street side setback.
But this calls it a minimum street side yard setback.
Yes.
But then you're saying the front load, garage doors facing front load, front lot line. That's
Right.
a different building line than the side is.
The side yard can be 15 feet if the garage faces forwards. So if the garage,
Is there a 15-foot building line on the side lot? Is that what we're trying to say?
yes, if the garage faces forwards.
No, it doesn't matter where they're facing. Do we have a side building line? What is the
Yeah,
side lot building
the
line?
setback.
On the lots?
It's 15 or 20 feet depending on which way the garage faces.
No, it doesn't have anything to do with the garage. The building line is established somewhere else. I mean, you got it on it. They don't have it on a plat because we don't have a plat. So we're establishing side building lines like you establish them elsewhere. And I don't know where it's established.
It isn't established. This regulation would establish it.
And this is an existing regulation. So it's
Yeah, this isn't new, but the 20 feet gives you, if the garage faces that street side, it gives you that room to get the vehicle
I
up and
understand.
away.
No, I know the 20 feet, Doug. That's
Right.
no, I don't have a problem with that because you got to have room to get the car
Yes,
off
sir,
the
right.
street. And you probably need a little more if you're going to block the driveway anyhow. I mean, the sidewalk, if but I'm not going to go there. But I don't understand this 15 feet. Except the only thing I see 15 feet on is when the house and the garage faces the front, and the garage, the way I read it, if it's attached, it has to be 15 feet behind the front of the house. And that's not what that says. It says it's a front load garage door facing front lot line. 15 feet. Well, 15 feet from where? The front lot line?
From the side,
From the side.
lot line.
It doesn't say that, in my opinion.
minimum street side yard setback. That is the regulation.
But we're facing this front of the street. We're not concerned with the side yard with our garage. The garage is going out to the front.
Right.
Right, but it's the side wall of the garage that's got to be 15 feet.
It doesn't matter. If it's part of the house, it'll automatically be there. It's not a separate setback.
This is for a detached garage. This falls under the detached garage requirement.
Okay, but where's so you're saying that if it's a detached garage, it's back in the back, we'll assume, and it's still got to be 15 feet off of the side lot?
Right.
they'll never have a detached garage back there. There's enough room in the lot. If you got 15-foot side setbacks, that's 30 feet. That's half the lot. I'm just.
There's varying lot widths in the hill, but yes.
Yeah, but they're not 80, 90 feet. I think there's something here that doesn't pass my smell test. I'm sorry. These numbers don't, you can't make it work. You say that the minimum lot width is 60 feet, and on a corner lot, it's 70 feet. The maximum
Carl,
lot width.
hang on just a second. I would like to hear from Terry and see if she has any input on this that can maybe explain this.
Who?
I don't know if I can help with this. I'm sorry, I don't think I can.
You don't? Okay.
No. Just to clarify, so this is an existing regulation. The regulations that are highlighted in yellow is what we're proposing to be either added or modified. So the regulation that Commissioner Carl is referring to is an existing regulation. So we're not proposing for that to be changed.
Okay, so there's some homes over there that obviously already comply with that, if it's existing. Is that, am I correct?
Right.
All right. But all I'm saying is if you got a 60-foot lot, and what I'm reading this to mean is you're establishing a 15-foot side lot, that's the side lot setback. Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but that's what you're saying. And so that means out of a 60-foot lot on each side, I got 15 feet building setbacks. I can only build on 30 feet of that lot.
So Carl, this is actually the street side. So it's only applicable to corner lots that have a street on the front and one side. So it's 15 feet only on the street side to the garage.
No, it's 20 feet on the street side if it's going to the street side.
If it's right, but the 15 refers to if the garage faces forward from the side of the garage to the street side will have to be 15 feet.
Only if it's on.
It's impossible to have that on a 60-foot lot.
Right, but corner lots have to be a minimum of 70 feet.
It'll be impossible, I think, on a 70-foot lot.
Except that there's already homes over there that comply with it.
I want to know what is the side lot setback if it's 15 feet on each side, whether it's a corner lot or an interior lot.
10 feet is the interior setback.
So you still got, front low garage door facing front lot line. That means that's an interior, to me, that's an interior lot. So, I'm telling you, you can't fit it on there. But don't worry about that when somebody comes to class for a permit. And then this detached, down here further down, detached one-story garage, minimum side yard setback, minimum your rear yard, 1.5 feet. Now we've gone from 15 feet up there to 1.5 feet down here. Something's not shucking and jiving here, people.
There are existing one-story garages that are located 1.5 feet from the property. And so what we're proposing here is to establish a maximum height of 16 feet. So we don't allow two-story.
I'm not talking about the height. I'm talking about the setbacks.
Yes, and there are existing structures that are that close to the property line because that is the character of this area.
So therefore, we've got probably garages that are in utility easements.
Potentially, but I believe that some of them are located or respected the alleyway. So they may not be in the easements.
Well, we need to know before we set these kind of dimensions.
These are existing regulations, the setbacks for 1.5 feet.
All right. We'll work it out later, I guess. When the utilities go in there and tear them out, I don't care.
Okay, I have a question. If somebody is wanting to build, do they have to get approval first if it complies with all of this so that we know that it's not being built over utility easements? Or so that, and then they'll have to adjust their plans accordingly? Or are they just allowed by right, according to this, to build whether it's over a utility easement or not?
They can't build anything new over a utility easement.
Right, so they would need to submit a
legally
survey.
Right.
And the property survey would show the utility easements.
I assume, Doug, that they are recorded utility easements.
That's our understanding. I know Ruth and Abby did some research on that. We'll also talk to engineering a little bit further, kind of based on some of your earlier comments, and this staff will bring you a little more information to the commission. But in any district, we're not going to sign off on a house on any utility easement, no matter what the setbacks are. Yes, sir. Right.
Well, but I'm saying if there's nothing recorded, how do you know there's a utility there?
I did some research on some original deeds in the neighborhood, and the deeds note the easements.
In some of the original deeds that was
Yes.
done in this deal?
Yes.
So that would be separate instrument work. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Right.
that's what,
Right.
It's.
I think that's where you're going with. Yes, sir.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So that, I think, with that understanding, are you okay with that, Carl?
Well, when they say that the rear yard, minimum rear yard setback is 1.5 feet, yeah, I have a problem, because I'm concerned that there's some sort of easement back there that's at least, back in those days, it should have been 16, and now there'd be 14, but if it's split, it's 7 or 8, but it's still more than the 1.5. That's where I'm getting.
Well, if we can't, there's really nothing we can do about what's already built. But knowing that if somebody comes along, that they have to have a survey.
But what I'm saying is that this says they can do it for 1.5 feet. And they're going to come down there. Somebody's going to come in there with a set of plans, 1.5 feet. And then Doug and them's going to pull out and say, no, you got a utility easement here. And they're going to say, well, I didn't know that. You didn't tell, it's just, don't give them that. Just, if there's easements there, just set it back, and that solves that problem. That gives, I can work that out, I guess, later.
Well, let me ask if it would, if maybe it would be, I'm trying to think of a way to word it so that, something to say, so long as not in a utility easement, or I don't know, or I don't know, some way so that they can't assume that they definitely get that 1.5 feet.
Well, that's what they're going to see if this is what's in the regs, and somebody pull that on you. That's all I'm saying. If this is what's going to be in the where are we at here?
Yeah, so keep in mind, we have had active construction in this neighborhood and across the city, obviously. And so easements are always something that are reviewed, taken into consideration, regardless of the restrictions that the zoning places on the property. Whatever is the most restrictive, obviously, would apply. So just like in the Hill, just like in other parts of Telfair or First Colony, those things are reviewed whenever building permits are submitted to the city. So
you could
I know if that helps, but
that
is the reality.
You could add a phrase, something as simple as subject to field verification, and it puts the burden on the owner or the developer, the person that's building the new house on the track. If he bumps into a utility, he's got to go 8 feet off the property line or something. I mean, we can't foresee every potential here in an area that was never platted.
I think Dan brings up a good point. It seems like an easy fix to say subject to field verification, and then somebody can't say I bought this property assuming I could go 1.5 feet off, and now you're telling me I have to be 10 feet off because of a utility easement. Like he says, that puts the onus back on the property owner. And I don't know, would that be an issue to add something like that?
I'm going to take a stab at that. Following what Carl's been talking about. Since this is really the only district that we've got that small of a setback, we can look internally, and Abby and Lisa and I can look at something maybe similar to that, because you won't find another district normally. And I think that's where Carl was going. You won't find another district normally that'll let you be that close to anything. Right. So I think we can look internally at that, because it's kind of unique to this area. So we'll take a stab at that.
Dan brings up a good point. Maybe you wordsmith it some more. Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to redo the whole thing, but you set it up so that you've done it right. You've said it here, so they got to be aware. Then if they're doing somebody doing their homework. So
right, and I see your point, Carl, and I think Dan brings up a good way to address it. And so if you would just look at it, and that way anybody looking at this doesn't assume they've got carte blanche to go to within 1.5 feet. They understand that there may be some limitations depending on the lot, and then that way there's no confusion.
We'll take a look at that, Abby and Lisa and I, and see what might work best for them.
All right, good. Okay, on page 10 of this thing, this shed deal, I'm not sure. Under E, it says maximum size of accessory structures is 225 square feet, or 25% of the required rear yard setback. So we've got to, this says I got to establish the setback on the rear, whether it's 1.5 or 10 feet or whatever. This 25% of the rear setback. So there's a calculation that gets into that too on sheds. Just pointing out what you're going to run into. And then under F of that, what is the structure? Accessory structures, other than private garages. Here they got a minimum rear yard setback of 5 feet. You got in here. So it's all that thing with back to the UEs and how do you, all those places you better wordsmith it some, or you're going to end up with a bunch of always problems. If anybody, that's just my opinion. And over here in this the next page, on page 1 of, I don't know where we switch, regulation comparison table, where you're talking about minimum rear yard setbacks, you got 15 feet. And minimum side yard setbacks, you got 15 feet. What did they say over here? Got to cover the garage, must be located at least. Then under M, it says the private garage must not exceed maximum 27 and must be located at least 1.5 feet from any rear or side lot. You got, everywhere you got that rear deal, you better get that straightened out, or you're going to end up in trouble. That's all I got.
Okay, thank you, Carl, and thanks to staff for looking at that and making your recommendation for us at the next meeting. I echo, I think, what Dan and Matt said. The feedback on these surveys was very helpful, and I think you all have done a great job of taking the comments from those and the desires of the people who live there and putting together something. And so I really commend staff. You all always do a good job. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Unless there's any other comments, anybody, before we move on? Okay, we'll move on to item 5, the workshop. 5A, review of and discussion on proposed Imperial Highway 6 District Tract 1 Final Development Plan. Laura.
Okay, so unmuted and ready to go. So this evening, the last item will be a review of or workshop for a final development plan. That's going to be for a planned development district. This is a special type of zoning that's prescriptive for each site individually. As I'm not sure exactly how familiar all of you are with the Imperial area, but it has gone through several different past planning procedures and documents. So I do want to walk you through a little bit of the history of the site as far as the planning and PDs go. So to begin with, we'll start with the location. So it is located along Highway 6 in the Imperial area at the intersection of Highway 6 and Crown Garden, directly across from the airport. So you can see that on the left side, we have a full map of the Imperial area. And then it's obviously pointed out and hatched that that is the small site in question. And then you can see on the right in an aerial map, we have single family residential on here on the right. And then so that's a Crown Garden single family. And then below it to the south, there is a commercial district that hasn't been brought forward yet for a final development plan. And then across Highway 6, of course, we have the airport. This does back up to the Oyster Creek area. So a Greenbelt Reserve is actually included in this area in addition to the commercial area. Next slide. So again, we're talking about Tract I. This is a small, just over an acre site. It is proposed for a commercial use, small retail center, and it does have several setbacks that are required by the general land plan, including a 65-foot building setback that does overlap with a 25-foot landscape buffer. So there is a 10-foot masonry wall, a 25-foot landscape buffer, and a 65-foot build line between the commercial and residential areas that were put in place in 2014 as part of the general land plan. And that general land plan does come before the P&Z and council. Then the general development plan came, and that is where the map on the right came from. There were 6 districts outlined in that general development plan, including this one as a commercial area. And there were quite a few uses that were listed, very general, kind of similar to what we would see today as our B2 general business area. However, this final development plan is narrowing down some of those uses in order to bring it more into a neighborhood service type area. Next slide. So just a brief overview of this item. It's 1.872 acres at Highway 6 and Crown Garden Trail. It does have 2 reserves proposed, a commercial reserve as well as the Greenbelt Reserve. And that commercial reserve would have about 9,800 square foot retail center and includes 65-foot build line, 25-foot landscape reserve, and 10-foot masonry wall that is already built. Access would be limited to Crown Garden, so there would not be direct access from Highway 6. And this rezoning is in line with the general land plan and general development plan, which gas sales is an important thing to note here. The general development plan did limit gas sales to only 2 locations, one of which is this one, but the final development plan does not outline as a proposed use. So the uses are very much limited in this area to lessen the impact on the neighboring residential area. Next slide. So here is an overall site layout plan. If you can see here in the kind of down the middle, there's the green belt on one side and then tract I on the other. So there is a 10-foot building and parking setback between the green belt and the commercial area, in addition to the 65-foot building setback and the 25-foot landscaping setback, landscape reserve, and 10-foot masonry wall. There is a 65-foot building setback from Crown Garden, and as well as a connection through this 10-foot shared use trail here along the back and the side. The trail does exist up here in the corner where Crown Garden begins. And so this does connect all of those pedestrian accesses through Crown Garden all the way back through the Greenbelt and ties it in nicely here at this small commercial area. Next slide. The landscape plan does propose quite a few trees, buffers around the area, the 25-foot landscape buffers along the Highway 6, Ground Garden Trail, and single family areas, and then a 10-foot landscape buffer along the Greenbelt area. Additionally, the trees will have to be 4-inch caliber, just as is typical in PDs and CUPs. So it is a fairly decent landscaping plan. Next slide. And then again, as I already mentioned, there is an existing 10-foot trail as well as 5-foot and 6-foot sidewalks along the Crown Garden areas. So this plan does propose to connect and complete all of those pedestrian accesses in order to have good circulation for pedestrian and bicyclists. Next slide. The applicant also provided several perspectives. Staff did note after we moved forward with this workshop item that no material callouts were included on these perspectives. So we have already mentioned that we would like to see that in any resubmittals and will be included as part of our workshop report. But we did want to include these perspectives so you can get a feel for exactly what the applicant is proposing. So this would be a view from the front. The camera would be kind of over the intersection of State Highway 6 and Crown Garden Trail. So this is looking towards the middle of the site. Next slide. This is a rear perspective. So you're looking kind of from over the bridge across Oyster Creek on Highway 6, looking at the back of the building and then towards Crown Garden Trail. So this is what the rear, there are no rear doors or any access from the back. The only access to and from the building is from the front. There's one limited door here at the very corner that would be for maintenance and other type things, but very minimal activity going on in the rear. Next slide. So I did take a couple of photos out of the site. The photo in the top left corner is of the existing sidewalks. So the sidewalk that kind of branches off here to the right is this sidewalk that does run along the 10-foot masonry wall. And then so in the distance here, this is where the bridge across Oyster Creek is. So this is looking from the residential corner towards the intersection. This picture here on the other side at the top, this right-hand side, is of the 5-foot wide pedestrian sidewalk that follows along the landscape border or buffer and the 10-foot masonry wall. And then down here at the bottom, this picture is actually taken from the rear corner and looking across towards the airport in the distance. So this is the intersection of Crown Garden and Highway 6, taken from the rear corner where the single family residential meets the Oyster Creek area. This picture was taken from the 10-foot shared use trail. So looking across the site that way. So it is an empty grass lot for right now, proposed to be built with about 9,800 square foot building. Next slide. So this is the future land use map. And as you can see, this area is proposed for regional commercial services, which is in line with the commercial use for PD. And so it is fully supported by the future land use map and plan. Next slide. So your points for consideration tonight, staff is looking for commission feedback on the proposed exhibits, as the retail center will be constructed in accordance with this final development plan. The use list is tailored to this development. It excludes gas sales and limits the size of any studio. So there are a couple of studio uses, such as ceramics, photography, furniture repair, and through staff recommendation, we did recommend putting size limits on those because it is such a small development and near to residential. Engineering staff also reviewed and did concur with the traffic impact analysis for this site. Again, the only access is from Crown Garden. There is no driveway to Highway 6. And this plan does include acreage all the way to Oyster Creek as part of the green belts, and they are including finishing out and completing that 10-foot shared use trail in order to make that happen. Next slide. There are a couple of small things that staff noticed while going through and writing these reports and collecting everything for you. A couple of small things. They need to define the two reserves separately. The open space is included in the definition, but there's not a percentage in the text. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the material callouts need to be added to the perspectives or elevations provided. Additionally, the trash enclosure is included on the site plan, but it's not actually labeled on the other exhibits, so labeling it on all of them. Just small things that staff has noticed so far. But the FDP is in alignment with the general land plan, the general development plan, and the future land use plan, all of which have come before P&Z and council before in the past. So there is a considerable amount of planning and work that has already gone into this site, and this is just kind of building on top of that, just finalizing and narrowing it down even more. This proposed use as a commercial retail area has been the designated land use since the original approval of the land plan in 2007. So this land has always been proposed as commercial, and this is continuing to narrow that down even further as neighborhood commercial type uses. Next slide. So with that having been said, we do have the applicants here tonight. We have Jerry Olkey with Johnson Development, as well as Peter Boscher, who is the planner who put this all together. So they will now take over and present their FDP in a more detailed fashion for you.
Good evening, Commissioners. This is Peter Boscher with the EHRA. And as Laura mentioned, also with us virtually is Jerry Olkey with Johnson Development. I'll try to be succinct and try not to repeat some of the comments Laura has. With that regard, we're going to go next to our next exhibits as Laura covered this first one. And so the next slide, please. And so I want to show to you how this PD is developed. We mentioned the commercial tract, which is the 1.519 acres. That's right at the corner of Crown Garden and State Highway 6 right of way. But as you'll see on the next slide, because of the widened right of way for State Highway 6, we're about 100 feet away from the paving within State Highway 6. So a little unusual circumstance compared to most sites, in that although we are on State Highway 6 right of way, there's quite a distance from the paving. And the next slide, please. There's the greenbelt tract we've added to the north. And just to clarify, it is a portion of the greenbelt to the north. It does not literally go to Oyster Creek, but it's a portion to capture the existing trail that you see in the upper right, and be able to extend that across the greenbelt tract and then down into the commercial tract to Crown Garden Trail. Next slide, please. And so that then comprises our 1.872 acre planned development. Next slide, please. Two photographs we have from Google Earth. This is from the intersection of Crown Garden Trail and State Highway 6. 6 to your left, Crown Garden Trail to your right. Looking across the property toward the northeast, you see the wall in the background. Also, if you look to your right down Crown Garden Trail, you see where the black asphalt type pavement ends and the white concrete pavement begins. That should be the right-of-way line between what is state right-of-way and what is city right-of-way. And then if you kind of extend that line to the left, you will, across the property, and you'll sort of see the change of vegetation. That should mark then the property line between what is state right-of-way in front of it and the property behind it. Next slide, please. Switching corners here, we're in the middle of Crown Garden Trail. You see the median that exists there, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then here's a wider view of the site looking across towards State Highway 6, where you see the existing sidewalk that runs parallel with the masonry wall, as well as the existing sidewalk that runs alongside Crown Garden Trail from the east. And Laura, just to make a comment here, in checking, Jerry and I checked the construction plans for the residential subdivision to the east, and that sidewalk, both the one going toward the creek and the one parallel to Crown Garden Trail, both show to be 5 feet wide on those construction drawings. So we need to check that. Then the next slide, please. Here's a site plan that Laura presented a moment ago. I'd like to just identify certain items with this so we can jump to the next slide. Highlighted in yellow on Crown Garden Trail is the median that's going to have to be adjusted to create a left turn lane for eastbound traffic on Crown Garden Trail to enter the bay and then make the left turn into the site, the one driveway on Crown Garden Trail. The property does not have near enough frontage on State Highway 6 to even get a driveway on State Highway 6. So you just got this one point of access in the southeast corner. Next slide, please. And then also I think we need to identify the easements on the property. On the east side towards 6, there is a pipeline easement along the outer edge that takes to the right-of-way line. Next to that are water and sanitary sewer easements. To the west, to the east, adjacent to the single-family residential, are 2 utility easements, electric and gas, which partly overlap. Next slide, please. And then to identify the building envelope pursuant to the building setbacks, 65 Crown Garden, 65 from the residential to the east, 10 along the green belt, 20 off of 6. That defines it in purple, the building envelope, in which you see there's approximately 10,000 square foot building. And then that leads us back to the next slide, which is simply the site plan again. And then if we could jump to I think the next one's perspectives. Oh, sorry, the trails. The trails you see in red, the trail in the green belt, dashed means is existing, solid means proposed. And so you see the proposed extension of that trail within the green belt coming around the backside and then down the west side of the track to intersect Crown Garden Trail. In blue is the existing and proposed sidewalk along Crown Garden Trail. And then in orange, you see the sidewalk or the walkway that goes from Crown Garden to the trail in the back, a portion of which will need to be adjusted to accommodate that new driveway location. So as you see on there, a portion of the sidewalk need to be relocated to make that happen. And there are also walkways connecting the sidewalk on one side and the trail on the other to the front of the building in between. Next slide, please. And these are the same perspectives you saw a moment ago. I think there's one more perspective you did not see. If we could jump 2 slides. This is the third perspective that staff asked for us, to kind of looking from the east. As you see there in the lower right, we've identified the single family residential to the east. Crown Garden Trail is toward the bottom, State Highway 6 off to the upper left, if you will. And so that would be the facade of the building facing Crown Garden Trail with Oyster Creek Greenbelt behind it. And so once again, that wraps up our presentation, and then we're ready for your discussion and questions.
Thank you, Peter. Does anyone, let me just start with Suzanne and ask if you have any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, I do. The presentation was great. And by the way, I really like this. I think it will serve the community, and it complements what we've seen across the street coming to us in the future. I have a couple of questions. One is about the shared use trails and the sidewalks. I don't know what the timeline is for actually construction, but will those start? Will we put in the trails and the sidewalks at any time before construction? And who's going to do that work?
Good evening, everybody. This is Jerry Olkey.
Hi.
I can speak to the timing of the construction. This is all part of the land sale we're doing to the commercial buyer, and those trails will be integrated with his site work. If he doesn't perform, then we will step in and perform. As you saw with what was existing versus what is proposed, We had made a temporary connection when Meritage Homes built the Crown Garden subdivision to run along that eastern edge of this site until we had a buyer and could figure out what their site is. So that one piece of sidewalk on that east side will likely be relocated to match up with their parking lot and site work, and to allow for the proper landscape beds and trees that they want to put in. But it will all go in as part of the full site work for when they start construction.
Okay, great. Because I don't know how long your timeline was, and I like the idea of the sidewalks and all that going in as soon as possible. Another question, you might have kind of hit on this. Do you have tenants that are looking to come in there? The last thing we want to do is have property without tenants, having vacant rental space that the neighborhood doesn't need. Do you have any potential outlook on that?
Well, as I mentioned, we are selling this tract. Johnson Development, we don't typically do the vertical construction. We find commercial users. I will tell you that this particular buyer has been under contract for 14 months as we have been battling with TxDOT regarding our traffic impact study and getting the approvals for that median modification that Peter had shown on the Crown Garden Trail. So there's been a length of time that was going through. I had a list of potential tenants. I can't say that I have confirmation that all of those are still the ones, but I will work to try to get that. But the buyer had a full tenant list as recently as before COVID, first of the year. So, COVID's made a lot of changes, but I will follow up with him again just to make sure if those are still the same tenants that he has on board and he's renewed with them their LOIs.
Great. I like this project. I want to see it go forward and filled out. The last question is kind of strange maybe, but I'm looking at the printout you have here with the landscape, and I'm looking at oak trees planted basically on top of pipeline easements. And I'm a little bit concerned about planting that type of tree. I'm not sure those are oak trees. My only concern is the future when those start growing and we have a lot of growth from roots going into pipeline easements and water easements. I'm not a landscape person, but I did live in a neighborhood where we had a lot of problems from sidewalks because of roots. So that's just a comment. I don't even know how to address that, but you can take it or leave it. I don't want to see you having to pull up stuff.
No, and we understand that, and it's not abnormal to have trees, landscaping planted over easements, particularly water lines. Most water lines by city code have to be 4 foot deep. The pipeline that was out there has been there since before we took over the project. And we have placed upwards of 6 foot of fill to raise the site along here to get it up out of the floodplain. And so we're not worried about the gas pipeline that's out there. It's a Houston pipeline, I think's who it is. But they're aware of what our plans are, and because of their depth, they claim they have the right to remove them, but they just come in and bore new lines when it comes time. And the same thing with the water lines. Case in point is along kind of the city's lot B, the baseball parking lot that's just south of this, that we have the water lines and the force mains that are along that landscape easement that are just outside the parking area down through there also. So it's doable with the extra depth, but I do understand and have seen the concerns with sidewalks when the roots start buckling the sidewalk and things of that nature. And that just comes with shallow watering practices and making those roots come to the surface instead of going down for their nourishment.
And also to clarify, on the landscape plan, pursuant to the landscape regulations to go back to the general development plan, there are X amount of trees that are required around the perimeter based on the frontage and the length of the property. And so that's what we're showing in that drawing. We're not showing exactly where those trees are going because I know we're not going to put them in the pipeline easement, for example. But X number of trees are going to be required pursuant to the PD regulations. And so we wanted to display those required trees that will be needed around the perimeter. Yes, they're going to need to move some from where we show them, but that number of trees is what's going to be required.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much for answering. That's it.
Thank you, Suzanne. We'll move on to Andy. I don't know if you have any questions, Andy.
Asking to fill a number of trees per linear foot. I was more worried about when I looked at the actual pictures, it looked like those would be right underneath power lines. So that was my other concern with that. A question, not necessarily for you from a development standpoint, but towards us with the Laura, with the city. What happens with the 25 foot in between Highway 6 and the landscaping buffer? Is that just going to forever be grass field? Is that
So
just
yes,
pipeline easement?
so that 100 feet of right of way is owned by the state, so that they can widen the highway that entire 100 feet if they choose to exercise that right. Really what we're concerned about here in the PD is the 25-foot landscape buffer that starts at the property line and then goes in before you get to any parking lot or building.
Yeah, my question was then next, with that being so far back from Highway 6, I didn't see, and I guess I wouldn't see it here, you'd see it with the development plans, but I didn't see where signage would go. So that's, I guess, a different issue, not a zoning issue.
Right, so signage will actually, it's all permitted separately from a PD, but there are there's some language in here about signage, I believe.
Okay.
In letter H, freestanding signs.
Yes. Got it. This is always intended to be multi-tenant. What happens, would this be able to be used by a single tenant?
Peter, do you? Oh, Jerry, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for my mute button. I could see that it could potentially be a single tenant. I mean, but the current developer is not intended on it being that way. From his building layout and the way he's proposing it, it's a multi-tenant building. It's your traditional neighborhood retail, and so it's not kind of falling under a potential office or a clinic or anything of that nature where you would have a large single tenant user.
And you don't have the parking to have a restaurant, so it's not going to be a restaurant.
Yeah, okay. And then I also wanted to echo that I appreciate, as the resident hike and bike guy, I appreciate that you are doing your part to extend the trail. So thank you. That's all I had.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Matt, do you have any questions?
No questions.
Thanks, Matt. How about you, Dan?
I just have one, and I understand the staff mentioned and the owner developer mentioned that the traffic impact analysis was approved. But in my experience, I'm surprised to see a single driveway. I understand you had to get the left turn lane and so forth. There's no shared use here to an adjacent development. I'm just surprised that it's a single driveway. Typically, there's at least two. Can staff speak to that, or?
I mean, I can speak a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, Peter, if you want to go ahead.
Oftentimes, the number of driveways can be driven by the fire code. And if you have X square footage of building or an occupied space, you've got to have more than one point of access, and they have to be separated. Because this is a small site with a small tract with a limited amount of square footage, there's not a that requirement to have 2 points of access that I think we're both used to typically seeing.
Right.
And you're not, once again, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to get it on State Highway 6 because of TxDOT's
Right.
access management manual. Yeah.
Right. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let's see, AP, you have any questions?
Just a couple. One I think is already covered in one of the exhibits. I just can't seem to find it, but I know that there was a restriction mentioned for a couple of types of services. Is there a restriction on any sort of drive-through activity or potential for that, just given?
Right. So, yeah. So there is a use list, and no drive-throughs are allowed according to that use list.
I knew I had seen that. I just can't find it right now. So just...
Yeah, it's Exhibit B-3
Okay.
between the parking and site plan and landscape plan.
And then more from my curiosity, what's the explanation behind the square footage restriction on the studios that were mentioned? I think it was glass and ceramics and metal woodwork. Is that's
right.
Based on land use or the PD itself?
So that is more from a practicality standpoint. We were trying to avoid a fairly large workshop of some sort that might create a lot of noise and potential outdoor activity because it's so close to the neighborhood. So we wanted to keep those maybe slightly more intensive uses limited to a smaller footprint in that case.
Okay, yep, that was it. Just wanted to confirm those two items. Great job.
And Commissioner, to your first question, in the text, in section C2, if you look there, that's where it says drive-through lanes are prohibited for all permitted uses.
Perfect.
And underneath that also is prohibiting outdoor speakers, since we've had that issue elsewhere.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Taylor.
Yeah, just real quick. This question may be answered by either letters of intent that are already in place or other. But looking at the permitted uses, is there a use that is not listed that should be considered for, let's say, a very small scale food service operation of some form or fashion? And Peter, I don't know, or Jerry, I'm not even sure if that's a viable use given what's proposed here, but given the proximity of the neighborhood and residential, I think, that something of that nature could be attractive to the residents.
From our point of view, the city, we would not recommend that for this site because it's so small, the parking is limited. So they don't really have the capacity to be able to meet our parking regulations and still have room for parking for the other tenants. We do have fairly strict parking regulations as far as food places go. So that's why it was not included on the list, because they can't really park the property because it's such a small area.
And Laura, correct me, but don't you have a greater parking requirement for food service or restaurants?
Yes, we do. Food service is quite a bit more strict.
Yeah. So there's not the capacity in the parking to have that food service use.
Sounds good.
Correct.
Thanks.
Thank you, Taylor. Jay, do you have any questions?
Yes, ma'am. I have a couple. Laura, you mentioned for the final edition, you wanted to see the two reserves to be defined in the text.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by that?
So right now, it actually, when it's talking about the landscape, it mentions that there's just one for the single reserve, but there's actually technically two reserves, the commercial and the greenbelt. So we're just going to ask them to clarify those definitions.
You might even consider under the meets and bounds descriptions, you call them Exhibit A, Part 1, Exhibit A,
Part 2. Mm-hmm.
You might even consider one call it the commercial tract and the other the greenbelt.
The greenbelt tract. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we'll add that specification.
The other question I had on Exhibit B6, the pedestrian and bicycle circulation. Mm-hmm. The southeast corner of the building, you show a pedestrian walkway crossing there with the concrete sidewalk picking up there at the curb. Okay, then switch over to the Exhibit B9, the building side perspective that shows.
There's not one on the concrete there.
There's no sidewalk. Can we fix that?
Yes.
You can.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Carl.
Okay. On your the services or the use list on this, no, I'm going to sound real terrible, but I would suggest, Jerry, that you get them to remove the place of worship. I think that's going to create parking problems and all kind of stuff. I don't think this is a site that is big enough, and so I would request that you get that use removed from the list. Okay, Jerry?
And I'm fine with that, but I was just curious because of the statements that were made on the earlier agenda items about we couldn't restrict that over, like over there in the HR1 that was all discussed for the last 3 hours. We couldn't restrict it over there.
No, it's not allowed it. I mean, if I were the guy that was doing it, I wouldn't want one in there. Some of the commercial guys I've talked to said the kiss of death is to have a worship deal in a commercial deal like that.
The issue we have here, Carl, is that you legally, I believe, I might be incorrect, Shay, but correct me if I'm wrong. I believe you legally have to allow a place of worship.
We haven't allowed a place of worship in a lot of things.
No, that's not the case? Okay.
I think there is some flexibility to limit that. Even the hill, Jerry, that we were talking about, and Carl, was CUP only. They couldn't do it by right. You'd have to do a conditional use permit. So I think that that could be looked at a little further. I don't know if there's any change in some of the federal laws, but Shay can help us with that or look into that.
You can certainly limit the size. I'd be concerned about prohibiting a multi-faith prayer room because you're seeing that sometimes in an office building.
All right, well.
Which have with specific uses. But you certainly can limit the size as done with other uses.
Well, if you define it well enough, you might be able, but just place of worship, God, it could be the whole building. If you want to make a church, then fine. But I'm not against religion. Don't get so.
Yeah, we want the tax dollars. We don't want another church. We already got.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that, Carl. Thanks for pointing that out.
And then on page 4 of the whatever it is here, says lighted. This is under 3A5. Lighted with pedestrian scale fixtures not less than 1 per pedestrian walkway and shall not exceed 15 feet in height. Location and quantity to be determined at site plan review. Who is doing the site plan review? How does that? I've never seen that.
Yeah. So site plan review is done by staff. It's a large process so that you have to get a site plan before you can get any kind of building permits. It's something that's, it goes through our development review committee. So a multitude of departments look at all these plans. And so those specific locations depend on how long and exactly where they do end up placing some of their landscape and side paths and trails. So we would confirm those locations specifically in the site plan.
So
I'd just like to add one thing. I just want to be clear. We purposely did not light that hike and bike trail along Oyster Creek because we did not want to invite late evening pedestrian traffic down through there because of the proximity to the creek and behind the houses. So as we're going through that, I just want to make sure nobody's expecting lights on that Oyster Creek Trail system.
Right. So this is actually, it's talking about the pedestrian walkways within Tract I, which is different from the Greenbelt. So
Perfect.
this is
Thank
just
you.
for the sidewalks around the parking lot and around the building itself. It is
Perfect.
not the shared use trail.
And this is standard language. We've had a number of PDs, probably one of the few things in Sugar Land PDs that hadn't changed in the last
I never have
10+ years.
That. Well, I haven't seen that.
That's
It's
pretty
been
standard.
in most of our FDPs.
A lot has evolved. That one hasn't.
On your exhibit B9, your building side perspective, looks to me like that's the same front drawing that you had over there.
Yes, it's the same front of the building, just from the other corner, because we wanted to be able to capture what the side of the building that was facing the residential would look like.
Yeah. Looks like the same, but anyhow, you picked up the labels on the materials. Thank you. On the trash location, I mean, you know, where it's at, we need a detail of what that's gonna also look like. Or as a brick or whatever, if you know, on your site plan, you've got just trash, and we don't know if it's a 6-foot brick or whatever. And you got a place to put it. I want to see what it's going to look like with the rest of it.
You can see a corner clip on B9 of it. Our builder code for our commercial association does require that they be masonry in nature. So we can get it enlarged to include it for you.
Just show that.
Yes, that would be perfect. Just adding
an
elevation of it.
Here or whatever, but we need to make sure I don't want you shortchanging me here. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Doug, I'm just going back to the places of worship. It seems to me that St. Martin's on Burney Road, wasn't that a CUP when that came in? Do you remember?
That was one of my early efforts back with the early 2000s. That's correct. So they had to go through that process. That's right.
Right. So just brainstorming and thinking that was a CUP. Well, does anyone else have any other questions before we move on?
I wanted to say one thing real quick, just kind of for the P&Z on this. Although this site is pretty small, not only did we feel like the applicant has done a good job, but this is an example of a site where a lot of prior planning, especially some of y'all that have been on for a long time, the work in the general land plan, not exciting, but the detail work, the buffering, all that, the brick walling, that makes this a lot easier than something coming in without that type of planning. So I just want to kind of put that out there for the P&Z. A lot of work that y'all have already done on this makes it a lot easier to plug in this type of final plan without a lot of residential proximity issues. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Doug. If no one else has any other questions, then we will move on to item 6, reports. 6A, Planning and Zoning Commission Liaison Report to the meetings for City Council held on May 19th and 26th. Who would that be?
That's me.
Thank you, Matt.
Sure, brief report, Madam Chair. On the May 19th meeting, pertinent to the P&Z, the only item was passed on the consent agenda was the conditional use permit for the automotive oil change facility located on 0.828 acres located to the northwest intersection of State Highway 6 and Settlers Way within the general business B2 zoning district. That passed on the consent agenda with no discussion. And I believe that was the only thing pertinent to P&Z at that meeting. And then on the May 26th meeting, there were no items that were directly pertinent to P&Z. There were 2 workshops during that meeting. One was on the Sugarland All-In for Sugarland, Texas business campaign, which was, a really interesting way to try to leverage gift cards for businesses that have been affected by COVID-19. And the other item was a review of the city's financial management policy statements. So again, nothing directly pertinent to P&Z at that meeting either.
Okay, thank you, Matt. We'll move on to item B, City Staff Report.
Only thing we have, just looking ahead towards your meeting in June on the 9th, we still anticipate, we think at this time that will probably be virtual remote meeting. So that right now, that's the best information we have. We are looking at the likelihood of the River Park, matter of fact, proximity CUP, coming back. They've done some additional work since the commission's feedback on that back in about 2 months ago. And we're still kind of looking at the agenda from other items. So that's all we have. And we're getting close to June here.
Thank you very much, Doug. And thanks to all the city staff for all the work that's gone into making all of this work virtually. I know you guys have put in a lot of time and effort, and we're really grateful to you during this pandemic. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Jay. Who seconds?
I'll second.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're now adjourned. Thank you all so much. Good night.
Say, Matt?